The stadium was buzzing with excitement as fans filled the seats, waving colorful flags and chanting for their favorite teams. It was a perfect afternoon, with the sun shining brightly overhead and the breeze carrying the echoes of cheers through the air. Today was the long-awaited championship match between two of the most formidable teams in the league, the Lakeside Lions and the Maplewood Mavericks. The stakes were high, and the tension on the field was palpable. The scoreboard showed a tight score, 2-2, with only 15 minutes left on the clock. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, each second ticking by with the intensity of a heart-pounding thriller. "Come on, Lions," someone shouted from the stands. The Lakeside Lions fans were especially vocal, hoping their team would pull off a last-minute victory. The players, drenched in sweat, were giving it their all, sprinting across the field with every ounce of energy they had left. In the heart of the action was Daniel, the star midfielder of the Lions. Known for his quick reflexes and unbreakable spirit, he was the player his teammates relied on in high-pressure moments like this. His jersey, with the number 7 emblazoned on the back, was already soaked through, but his focus remained razor-sharp. "Daniel! Over here," yelled Ethan, the captain of the Lakeside Lions, as he positioned himself near the opponent's goal. But Daniel had no intention of passing the ball just yet. He saw an opportunity and decided to seize it. With a deft flick of his foot, Daniel dribbled past two Maplewood Mavericks defenders. The crowd erupted in cheers as he maneuvered skillfully, leaving the defenders scrambling behind him. "He's unstoppable today," one of the commentators exclaimed, their voice crackling through the stadium's loudspeakers. However, just as Daniel was about to make his final approach toward the goal, a Mavericks player, David, charged at him with a fierce tackle. The impact sent Daniel stumbling, but he managed to keep his balance. He quickly regained control of the ball and looked up. The goalpost was now within striking distance. "Take the shot, Daniel." Mr. Carter, the Lions coach, shouted from the sidelines, his voice a mix of desperation and encouragement. But before Daniel could kick the ball, a Maplewood Maverick striker intercepted it, turning the game in the opposite direction. The Mavericks were now on a counter-attack, and the ball was speeding toward the Lions' goal like a bullet. Without a moment to waste, Daniel sprinted back to defend. He was panting heavily, his legs burning from exhaustion, but he pushed through. The Maverick striker, Liam, was closing in fast. As Liam prepared to shoot, Daniel leaped into the air, using his head to deflect the ball. The ball ricocheted off Daniel's forehead with a loud thud, soaring high above the field. The crowd erupted in applause, amazed at Daniel's daring save. But then, an eerie hush fell over the stadium. As Daniel landed back on the ground, he staggered, his vision blurring. For a moment, everything around him seemed to spin, the cheers of the crowd fading into a distant hum. His knees gave way, and he crumpled to the ground, clutching his head. "Daniel!" Ethan screamed, rushing toward his fallen teammate. The referee blew his whistle, signaling for the game to pause. Players from both teams gathered around Daniel, concern etched on their faces. Mr. Carter, who had been pacing anxiously on the sidelines, sprinted onto the field, his face pale. "Daniel, can you hear me?" Mr. Carter yelled, kneeling beside his star player. But there was no response. Daniel's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The fans, who had been cheering just moments ago, were now silent, their excitement replaced by worry. "Get the medics out here, now!" Ethan shouted, waving frantically at the sidelines. Two medics rushed over with a stretcher, pushing through the crowd of players. "What happened to him?" Liam, the Maverick striker, asked with genuine concern. "I saw him take that header, it didn't look that bad." "It wasn't a rough hit at all," David added, shaking his head in confusion. "He's taken harder blows before." The medics quickly examined Daniel, checking his pulse and shining a small flashlight into his eyes. "He's unconscious," one of them said grimly. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." As they lifted Daniel onto the stretcher, Mr. Carter turned to Ethan, his voice shaking. "Go grab my car, Ethan. We don't have time to wait for an ambulance." Ethan nodded and sprinted toward the parking lot. But when he reached Mr. Carter's car, he found it blocked by another vehicle. Frustration boiling over, he muttered, "Who parks like this during a championship game?" With no time to lose, Ethan rushed back to the field. "Coach, your car's blocked. I can't get it out." "Then use your bike," Mr. Carter ordered. "We need to get Daniel to the hospital now." Without wasting another second, Ethan grabbed his motorcycle helmet and revved up his bike. Mr. Carter and the medics carefully placed Daniel on the back, securing him between them. "Hold on tight," Ethan shouted as he accelerated out of the stadium. The roar of the motorcycle cut through the tense silence, and fans watched with bated breath as Ethan weaved through traffic. The roads were congested, cars honking and people yelling as they tried to clear a path. But Ethan was relentless, determined to save his friend. Come on," Mr. Carter muttered, clutching tightly to Daniel to keep him steady. "Just a little longer, Daniel. Hang in there." Meanwhile, back at the stadium, the players from both teams stood around, confused and worried. The referee called for a temporary suspension of the match. "What do you think happened to him?" Adam asked Liam, glancing nervously at the spot where Daniel had collapsed. "I don't know," Liam replied, shaking his head. "He just fell. 1 second he was fine, and the next." High above, the stadium announcer tried to calm the restless crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience as the game is temporarily paused due to a medical emergency. Please remain seated, and we will provide updates as soon as we have them." In the stands, Olivia and Emma, two dedicated fans of the Lakeside Lions, exchanged worried glances. "What do you think happened, Olivia?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Olivia replied, biting her lip. "But I have a bad feeling about this. Maybe we should call Detective Blake. He might be able to help." Emma nodded, pulling out her phone. "Yeah, we need to get to the bottom of this." As Ethan raced towards the hospital with Daniel still unconscious, a cloud of mystery loomed over the stadium. What had caused the sudden collapse of one of the league's best players? The fans, the teams, and even Detective Blake were about to uncover a secret far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. This expanded version includes detailed dialogues, character interactions, and vivid descriptions to set the scene and draw listeners into the story. Let me know when you're ready for the next chapter. The deafening roar of the stadium crowd came to an abrupt halt, replaced by a chilling silence. Time seemed to freeze as Daniel, the star midfielder of the Lakeside Lions, lay motionless on the field. Moments ago, he had executed a spectacular header, deflecting a dangerous shot by the Maplewood Mavericks. But now, he was lying on his back, eyes closed, and completely unresponsive. Daniel! Daniel! Ethan, the Lions' captain, was the first to reach him. He dropped to his knees beside his friend, shaking him frantically. "Daniel, can you hear me? Wake up, man." His voice cracked with desperation as he looked around, hoping for help. The referee blew his whistle repeatedly, signaling for an immediate stop to the game. "Medic! We need a medic over here," he yelled, waving his arms to catch the attention of the medical team stationed on the sidelines. The other players, who had been chasing the ball just seconds ago, now crowded around Daniel, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "What happened?" asked Liam, one of the Mavericks players, peering over the shoulders of the others. "Did he get hit too hard?" "No, he just collapsed," replied David, another player from the opposing team, scratching his head. "He's taken harder hits before. This doesn't make any sense." Meanwhile, Mr. Carter, the coach of the Lakeside Lions, was sprinting across the field. At his age, running wasn't easy, but the sight of Daniel lying on the ground had given him a burst of adrenaline. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the sprint, but from sheer terror. Move aside, let me through. Mr. Carter shouted as he pushed past the concerned players. Kneeling beside Daniel, he placed a hand on the young player's forehead. Daniel's skin was clammy, and his breathing was shallow. "Daniel, it's Coach," Mr. Carter said softly, trying to coax a response. But there was nothing. No flicker of his eyes, no twitch of his fingers. Just the eerie stillness of someone lost in darkness. "Coach, is he going to be all right?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The usually strong and composed captain was now on the verge of tears. This was more than just a game, Daniel was like a brother to him. "I don't know, Ethan," Mr. Carter replied, his voice trembling. "But we can't wait any longer. We need to get him to a hospital." The medics finally arrived, carrying a stretcher. "Step back, please," one of them commanded, trying to clear some space around Daniel. They quickly checked his pulse, flashed a light into his eyes, and listened to his breathing. "He's got a pulse, but it's weak," one of the medics reported, his brow furrowed. "We need to transport him immediately." "Coach, I'll get your car," Ethan offered, already bolting toward the parking lot. The idea of waiting for an ambulance seemed excruciating, every second counted. "No, Ethan. Wait." Mr. Carter shouted after him, but it was too late. Ethan was already dashing up the stadium stairs. The coach turned back to the medics. "Just keep him stable until we can get him to the hospital." The medics nodded, continuing their efforts to keep Daniel breathing steadily. Fans in the stands began to murmur, anxiety rippling through the sea of people who had gathered to see a thrilling match, not a medical emergency. "What's happening down there?" Olivia asked Emma, her eyes wide with worry as they watched from their seats. Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know," Emma replied, gripping the edge of her seat. "I think they're trying to get him to the hospital." Up in the announcer's box, the commentator's voice quivered as he updated the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, the match has been temporarily suspended due to a medical emergency. We ask for your patience as the medical team attends to Daniel, the star midfielder of the Lakeside Lions." Back on the field, Mr. Carter was pacing restlessly, eyes darting toward the parking lot, hoping to see Ethan return with the car. But the seconds felt like hours, and the tension was suffocating. Suddenly, Ethan came running back, panting heavily. "Coach, I couldn't get the car out. It's blocked by another vehicle," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "What do we do now?" Without missing a beat, Mr. Carter made a quick decision. "Forget the car. Use your bike. It's faster anyway." "My bike? But, it's risky. He might not be able to sit up." "We don't have a choice, Ethan." Mr. Carter cut him off. "We need to get him to the hospital now, or he won't make it." Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." He sprinted back to where he had parked his motorcycle. The medics carefully lifted Daniel onto the bike, positioning him between Ethan and Mr. Carter, who would hold him steady during the ride. "Hang on, Daniel," Ethan muttered under his breath as he revved the engine. The motorcycle roared to life, and the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, urging them on. The sight of the bike tearing away from the stadium, carrying their beloved player, was both heart-wrenching and hopeful. As they sped through the city streets, Ethan pushed the bike to its limits. The engine growled louder and louder, almost as if it was protesting against the speed. Traffic was heavier than usual, with cars honking and people yelling. But Ethan expertly weaved between vehicles, narrowly avoiding collisions. "Watch out!" Mr. Carter yelled as a car suddenly swerved into their path. Ethan leaned the bike sharply to the right, barely missing the side mirror. "I've got it, Coach!" Ethan shouted back. But deep inside, he was terrified. The responsibility of keeping Daniel safe while navigating through chaotic traffic was overwhelming. Finally, the hospital came into view, its bright red sign glowing like a beacon of hope. Almost there, Daniel. Just hold on a little longer, Ethan murmured, feeling the weight of his unconscious teammate leaning against him. They screeched to a halt at the hospital entrance. The medical staff was already waiting with a stretcher, alerted by a call from the stadium. Mr. Carter and Ethan quickly helped lift Daniel off the bike and onto the stretcher. Take him to the emergency room, now. Mr. Carter shouted at the hospital staff, who nodded and rushed Daniel inside. Breathless and drenched in sweat, Ethan and Mr. Carter stood at the hospital entrance, watching as the doors swung shut behind Daniel. The two of them were left standing there, their adrenaline finally starting to wear off. Do you think he'll be okay, Coach? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, son, Mr. Carter replied, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. We did everything we could. Now it's up to the doctors. As they waited in the hospital corridor, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The roar of the stadium, the urgency of the ride, the life of a young player hanging by a thread, it was all too surreal. The championship match had taken an unexpected turn, transforming from a game of skill to a race against time to save a life. The once cheering fans were now left with bated breath, wondering what had truly caused Daniel's sudden collapse. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a much deeper mystery, one that would soon unravel secrets no one had anticipated. This chapter dives deeper into the panic and urgency of the moment, with dialogues, detailed descriptions, and emotional tension. Let me know when you're ready for the next point. The stadium was still in chaos. Fans murmured in confusion, players were pacing anxiously on the field, and the roar of cheers had been replaced by the unsettling murmur of concern. Daniel lay on the ground, still unconscious, with his coach, Mr. Carter, and team captain, Ethan, kneeling by his side. Damn it, Mr. Carter muttered under his breath, wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaky hand. We don't have time to wait for an ambulance. We need to get him to the hospital ourselves. Ethan nodded, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. Coach, I'll grab your car. I'll be back in a flash. With that, Ethan sprang to his feet and sprinted toward the parking lot, his heart pounding as if it were trying to burst out of his chest. Please be okay, Daniel. Just hold on, Ethan whispered to himself as he ran, the sounds of the concerned crowd fading behind him. His mind was racing just as fast as his feet. He couldn't shake the image of his best friend collapsing on the field, the life draining from his eyes. When Ethan reached the parking lot, he spotted Mr. Carter's old red sedan parked under a shady tree, exactly where the coach had told him. The problem was, it was sandwiched between another car in front and a massive SUV behind, leaving barely any space to maneuver. No, no, no. This can't be happening right now. Ethan cursed as he skidded to a halt. He tried yanking the handle of the car in front, hoping it might be unlocked, but it wouldn't budge. He quickly glanced around the parking lot, hoping to spot anyone, who could help him move the vehicles blocking the coach's car. But there was no one around. The parking lot was eerily empty, with most of the spectators still glued to their seats, watching the unfolding crisis on the field. Ethan's hands were shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Think, Ethan, think, he muttered to himself. They didn't have time to waste, Daniel's life was on the line. Then, in a flash of inspiration, he remembered his motorbike parked just a few spaces away. It was smaller, faster, and far more maneuverable than the coach's car. If they couldn't get Daniel to the hospital by car, the bike would have to do. Forget the car. I'll use the bike, he decided, sprinting toward his black motorcycle. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only option. Back on the field, Mr. Carter anxiously checked Daniel's pulse again. It was weak and erratic, but still there. The medics had done their best to stabilize him, but they needed to get him to the hospital immediately. The coach looked up, scanning the parking lot for any sign of Ethan. Where the hell is he? He muttered through clenched teeth. The seconds felt like hours, and every moment wasted could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, Ethan came roaring around the corner on his motorbike, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. He pulled off his helmet, his face flushed and breathless. "Coach, the car's blocked in. I had to grab my bike instead," he explained quickly. Mr. Carter hesitated for a moment, eyeing the motorcycle with concern. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Ethan? He's barely conscious. A bike ride might." "We don't have a choice, Coach." Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling with urgency. "The traffic's insane right now. We'd never get through with a car. The bike's our best shot." The coach nodded, realizing they had no other options. "All right, let's do it. But we need to be careful." Together, they carefully lifted Daniel onto the bike, positioning him between Ethan and Mr. Carter. The coach climbed onto the back, holding on to Daniel to keep him steady. "Hold him tight, Coach," Ethan warned. "I'm going to have to go fast." Mr. Carter wrapped his arms around Daniel, steadying the limp figure against his chest. "I've got him. Just focus on the road, Ethan. Get us there as fast as you can." With that, Ethan revved the engine, and the bike roared to life. The wheels screeched as they took off, speeding away from the stadium and into the chaos of the city streets. As they hit the main road, Ethan could see that traffic was even worse than he had feared. Cars were bumper to bumper, honking loudly as frustrated drivers tried to inch forward. But he didn't have the luxury of time or patience. He had to get Daniel to the hospital, fast. "Hang on, Coach." Ethan shouted over the roar of the engine as he swerved sharply to the left, squeezing the bike between two stationary cars. The tires screeched, but the bike slipped through the narrow gap. Mr. Carter tightened his grip on Daniel, his heart pounding. "Careful, Ethan. We don't need another person in the hospital," he called out, his voice tense with fear. "I know, Coach, but we have to get there." Ethan shot back. He leaned forward, dodging past a delivery truck and narrowly avoiding a collision with a taxi. His eyes were laser-focused, scanning for any opening in the wall of vehicles ahead. Every red light they encountered felt like a cruel joke from the universe. But Ethan wasn't about to let a traffic signal slow him down. With Mr. Carter yelling in protest, he sped through intersections, ignoring the angry shouts and honking horns that followed in their wake. "Sorry, folks, emergency coming through," Ethan muttered to himself as he navigated around yet another stalled vehicle. The hospital was only a few blocks away now, but traffic was at a complete standstill. He needed to think of another way. "There's an alley up ahead," Mr. Carter shouted into Ethan's ear. "Take it. It's a shortcut." Without hesitation, Ethan veered sharply to the right, bumping up onto the sidewalk and then turning into the narrow alleyway. The walls of the surrounding buildings seemed to close in on them, but the bike fit perfectly. "Almost there," Ethan said under his breath, as if trying to convince himself as much as the unconscious player in his arms. The alley opened up onto a side street that led directly to the hospital's emergency entrance. In one last burst of speed, they shot down the side street and skidded to a halt at the hospital entrance. The waiting medical team, alerted by a call from the stadium, rushed out with a stretcher. "Quickly, get him inside," Mr. Carter barked as they carefully lifted Daniel off the bike. The doctors and nurses wasted no time, whisking Daniel through the double doors and into the emergency room. Breathing heavily, Ethan and Mr. Carter stood there, watching helplessly as the doors closed behind them. The adrenaline that had been keeping them going was now draining away, leaving them exhausted and filled with dread. "Do you think he's going to make it?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking. He had never been this scared in his life. "I hope so, son," Mr. Carter said quietly, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did everything you could. Now it's in their hands." Ethan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the doors through which his teammate had disappeared. "Come on, Daniel, you have to pull through," he whispered to himself. The hospital lights glared harshly above them, but all they could do now was wait, hope, and pray for Daniel's life. Let me know when you're ready for the next point. The cold fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting area flickered ominously as Mr. Carter and Ethan sat side by side, their nerves taut as a wire. The emergency room doors had swung shut behind the medical team carrying Daniel, leaving them helpless in the sterile, white-walled corridor. The muffled sound of the bustling ER staff was the only indication that behind those doors, a life-and-death battle was taking place. Ethan's leg bounced restlessly, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his tousled hair. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear. How had everything gone so wrong? One moment, Daniel had been the star of the match, leaping into action to save their team. The next, he was unconscious, being rushed to the hospital. "Coach," Ethan said in a hoarse whisper, breaking the tense silence. "How did this happen? I don't understand." Mr. Carter sighed deeply, staring at the ground. He looked older than his years in that moment, with worry lines creasing his forehead. "I don't know, son," he replied, shaking his head slowly. "He just collapsed. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of coaching." Ethan leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. "He seemed fine, coach. We were all so pumped up for the game, and then, it's like something hit him out of nowhere." A few feet away, a nurse in blue scrubs walked past with a clipboard, glancing sympathetically at the two anxious men. They had been sitting there for nearly an hour, and every minute that passed felt like a slow torture. "Shouldn't we have heard something by now?" Ethan muttered, his voice cracking. "What's taking so long?" Mr. Carter put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, trying to calm him down. "These things take time, Ethan. They're doing everything they can for him. We just have to be patient." "But what if," Ethan's voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Hey, Mr. Carter said softly, squeezing his shoulder. "No what ifs. Daniel's tough. He's going to pull through this. You did good getting him here quickly. That bike ride might have saved his life." Ethan nodded weakly, though he wasn't convinced. He kept replaying the scene in his head, Daniel diving to block that shot, the ball striking his forehead, and then the horrifying sight of his friend crumpling to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. How could something so ordinary lead to this? Just then, the doors to the emergency room swung open with a hiss. A tall man in a white lab coat emerged, his expression serious but not unreadable. It was Dr. Thompson, the head physician on duty. He walked toward them, clipboard in hand. Mr. Carter immediately stood up, practically jumping out of his seat. "Doctor, how is he?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Is Daniel going to be okay?" Dr. Thompson gave them a small, professional smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's sit down for a moment," he said, gesturing toward the plastic chairs in the waiting area. The formality of his tone made Ethan's heart sink. The doctor took a seat across from them, letting out a weary sigh. "We've stabilized Daniel, but his condition is still critical," Dr. Thompson began. "He's unconscious and we're not yet sure of the cause." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. "What do you mean, you don't know the cause?" He just hit his head on the ball. It wasn't even that hard." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "Yes, I understand your confusion. It's not uncommon for athletes to sustain head injuries during matches, but in this case, it doesn't add up." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "What are you saying, doctor?" "Well," Dr. Thompson said slowly, as if choosing his words with great care, "based on the initial examination, it doesn't seem like a typical concussion. We've run some tests, and there's something unusual we discovered." Ethan's eyes widened. "Unusual? What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated, then continued, "There's a small puncture wound on the side of Daniel's head. It's almost imperceptible, but it appears to have been caused by something sharp, like a needle. What? Ethan and Mr. Carter said in unison, their voices laced with shock. Dr. Thompson nodded gravely. Yes, and that's not the most concerning part. There's evidence of a foreign substance in his bloodstream, something toxic. We're running more tests to identify exactly what it is, but whatever it is, it's very dangerous. The room seemed to spin around Ethan. He clutched the edge of his chair, trying to steady himself. You're saying, someone poisoned him? He asked, barely able to believe the words coming out of his own mouth. We can't say for sure yet, Dr. Thompson replied, but it's a possibility we can't rule out. The fact that the wound looks like it was caused by a needle and the presence of the toxin, it doesn't look accidental. Mr. Carter's face went pale. This is insane, who would do something like that? And why? Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his voice low and serious. That's something you might need to discuss with the authorities. For now, our priority is stabilizing Daniel. We've administered some antidotes and are doing everything we can to flush the toxin from his system, but we're not sure how long it's been in his bloodstream. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He thought back to the match. Was there someone who got close enough to Daniel to do this? He couldn't remember seeing anything unusual, but in the chaos of the game, who knows what could have happened. Mr. Carter looked over at Ethan, his eyes filled with determination. We need to get to the bottom of this. If someone did this to Daniel, they're not going to get away with it. Dr. Thompson stood up, signaling that their conversation was over for now. I'll keep you updated as soon as we know more, he said. In the meantime, try to stay calm. He's in good hands. Thank you, Doctor, Mr. Carter said quietly, shaking the physician's hand. As Dr. Thompson walked away, Ethan sank back into his chair, his mind swirling with anger, confusion, and fear. Coach, what are we going to do? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. We're going to find out who did this, Mr. Carter replied firmly. And we're going to make damn sure they pay for it. But first, we need to make sure Daniel pulls through. Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He has to make it, he said, his voice filled with resolve. He's not just our best player, he's like a brother to me. As the minutes turned into hours, they remained there, sitting in tense silence. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, casting a cold, harsh glow over the sterile waiting room. All they could do now was wait and hope that Daniel would wake up, and that they would have answers before it was too late. The quiet, tense atmosphere of the hospital waiting area was abruptly interrupted by the shrill ring of a phone. Emma, who had been pacing back and forth, pulled her phone out of her pocket, glancing at the screen. Olivia, seated nearby with a worried expression, looked up expectantly. It's Detective Blake, Emma said, relief momentarily flashing across her face. She quickly answered the call. Detective, it's Emma. We're at the hospital. You need to get here right away. What's going on, Emma? Detective Blake's voice came through the line, calm but laced with urgency. It's Daniel, he collapsed during the match, Emma replied, her voice trembling. It looked like a regular play at first, but the doctors, they think it might have been something more sinister. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Detective Blake spoke, his voice now laced with a steely resolve. I'm on my way. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Hang tight. Emma ended the call and turned to Olivia, who was staring at her with wide eyes. He's coming, Emma said, trying to reassure her friend. If anyone can figure out what's going on, it's Detective Blake. Olivia nodded, but her hands were shaking. I can't believe this is happening, she murmured, her eyes welling with tears. Daniel was perfectly fine. How could he just collapse like that? Emma wrapped an arm around her friend's shoulders. I don't know, Liv. But whatever happened, we're going to get to the bottom of it. True to his word, Detective Blake arrived at the hospital within minutes. He was a tall man with sharp features, a neatly trimmed beard, and an air of confidence that immediately commanded attention. As he walked through the hospital's automatic doors, his keen eyes swept across the bustling reception area, quickly zeroing in on Emma and Olivia. "Emma, Olivia," he greeted them, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Tell me everything you know." "Detective, it was so sudden," Olivia began, her voice shaking. "Daniel was playing in the match, and he had just blocked a shot with his head. He seemed fine for a second, but then, he just collapsed. It didn't make any sense." Detective Blake nodded, listening intently as they recounted the events. "The doctors found a small puncture wound on his head," Emma added. "And they said there's some kind of toxin in his bloodstream." Blake's brows furrowed. "A puncture wound? That sounds deliberate. Where is he now?" "They took him into emergency surgery," Emma replied. "The doctors said his condition is critical." Blake's eyes darkened. "That's troubling. If this was intentional, we could be dealing with something far more dangerous than an accident on the field." Blake wasted no time. He strode purposefully down the corridor towards the emergency unit, where Mr. Carter and Ethan were still waiting anxiously. They looked up as the detective approached, recognizing him immediately. "Detective Blake," Mr. Carter said, getting to his feet. "I'm glad you're here. We need answers." Blake nodded curtly. "I'll do my best to get them for you. But first, I need to understand exactly what happened on that field. Ethan, you were closest to Daniel when he collapsed, right?" Ethan nodded, his eyes still red from crying. "Yes, sir. He was blocking a goal. The ball hit his head, and then, he just went down. It didn't seem like anything serious at first. I thought maybe he was just stunned. But then he didn't get up." Blake's eyes narrowed as he took in Ethan's words. "Did you notice anything unusual before he collapsed? Any strange behavior from the other players or people in the crowd?" Ethan shook his head slowly, clearly struggling to recall the chaotic moments of the match. "No. I don't think so. Everyone was focused on the game. But now that you mention it, there was a lot of shoving and pushing near the goalpost. Maybe someone got close enough to, I don't know, do something to him." "That's a good lead," Blake said, making a mental note. "I'll need to review any footage from the game and speak to the other players. But first, I'd like to speak with the doctor handling Daniel's case." Just then, Dr. Thompson emerged from the emergency room, still wearing his surgical scrubs. His expression was grave, but there was a flicker of recognition as he saw Detective Blake approaching. "Doctor," Blake said, extending a hand. "I'm Detective Blake. I understand Daniel's condition is critical. Can you tell me anything more about that puncture wound?" Dr. Thompson shook the detective's hand firmly. "Yes, Detective. We've confirmed that there's a small puncture wound on the left side of his head, just above the ear. It looks like it was made with a very fine needle, possibly during the match." Blake's eyes narrowed. "And the toxin? What are we dealing with here?" Dr. Thompson sighed heavily. "We're still waiting on the lab results, but the symptoms suggest a fast-acting neurotoxin. If it had been left untreated for much longer, Daniel might not have survived." A heavy silence fell over the group as the gravity of the situation sank in. "So someone injected him with a toxin, right in the middle of a crowded stadium," Blake mused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "That's incredibly brazen. Whoever did this clearly had a plan." Mr. Carter's fists clenched at his sides. "Who would do such a thing? Daniel is just a kid, a promising player. Why would anyone want to hurt him?" Blake's gaze was steely as he looked around at the faces of the worried teammates and friends. "That's exactly what I intend to find out. But for now, I need access to the stadium security footage and a list of everyone who was on the field during the match." Emma and Olivia, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Detective, we can help with that," Emma offered. "We were seated right near the field and saw a lot of the players up close." Maybe we noticed something without realizing it. Blake nodded appreciatively. Any information you can provide would be helpful. I'll need you both to come down to the station later for a more detailed statement. Olivia, her face pale but determined, nodded. We'll do whatever it takes to help Daniel. He's our friend. Blake gave them a reassuring smile. I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this. As Blake continued his investigation at the hospital, tension hung in the air like a dark cloud. The once vibrant and energetic atmosphere of the match had turned into a grim pursuit of answers. Ethan, still reeling from the shock of seeing his friend in such a state, approached Mr. Carter. Coach, he said quietly, do you really think someone could have done this to Daniel? I mean, who would even have a reason? Mr. Carter's jaw clenched. I don't know, Ethan. But someone out there wanted to hurt him, maybe even kill him. And if that's true, we have to find them before they can hurt anyone else. Meanwhile, Detective Blake was already on the phone with his contacts, arranging to obtain the stadium's CCTV footage and preparing to interview anyone who might have witnessed something unusual. Time was of the essence, and he knew that every second counted if they were to catch whoever was responsible for this heinous act. But as he headed back to his car, his mind kept returning to one troubling question: what kind of person would go to such lengths to take down a young athlete in the middle of a game? And, more importantly, what could have driven them to do it? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there was still much more to uncover. Blake was determined to get to the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig, or how many secrets he had to unearth along the way. The cold, antiseptic smell of the hospital hung in the air as Detective Blake stepped into the dimly lit hallway leading to Dr. Harper's office. His mind was racing, trying to connect the dots of the puzzle that had suddenly taken a dark turn. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident during a football match was now looking more like a deliberate attack. As he approached the office, the door creaked open, and Dr. Harper, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, looked up from his desk. The doctor's face was drawn, his expression one of concern mixed with a hint of urgency. Detective Blake, I presume? Dr. Harper greeted, rising from his chair and extending a hand. Yes, doctor. I understand you have some critical information about Daniel's condition. Blake said, shaking the doctor's hand firmly. Dr. Harper nodded and gestured for Blake to take a seat. It's worse than we initially thought, Detective. Daniel's collapse wasn't just a result of a head injury from the game. I believe it was something far more sinister. Blake's eyes narrowed. Go on. What did you find? The doctor pulled a file from his desk and flipped it open, revealing a series of scans and notes. At first, we assumed it was a typical concussion, given the impact to his head. But when I examined him more closely, I discovered something unusual, Dr. Harper explained, his tone turning grave. He leaned forward, pointing to a detailed scan of Daniel's head. Do you see this tiny red mark here, right above his left temple? Blake leaned in, his detective instincts kicking into high gear. Yes, it looks like a puncture wound. Exactly, Dr. Harper confirmed, nodding. It's a small needle mark. I almost missed it myself. But when I saw it, I realized that it wasn't caused by the impact from the ball. It's too precise. Blake's eyes widened as he absorbed the implications. A needle mark? Are you saying someone injected him with something during the match? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Dr. Harper said, his voice steady but filled with concern. I ran some tests on Daniel's blood, and I found traces of a fast-acting neurotoxin. It's not something you can easily get your hands on. This is specialized, dangerous stuff. The detective leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. A neurotoxin, you say? That would explain why Daniel collapsed so suddenly. But how could someone have injected him in the middle of a crowded stadium without anyone noticing? Dr. Harper shook his head slowly. That's the mystery, isn't it? The wound is so small that it could easily be mistaken for a scratch or a bug bite. But the toxin works fast, within seconds, it would have started shutting down his nervous system. The fact that he's still alive is a miracle. Blake's expression grew more intense. How long does he have, Doctor? Is he going to pull through? Dr. Harper's eyes darkened, and he let out a weary sigh. We're doing everything we can to neutralize the poison, but it's touch and go. He's stable for now, but if we don't figure out exactly what kind of toxin was used, we might not be able to counteract it in time. There was a heavy silence in the room as Blake absorbed the doctor's words. Can you identify the specific type of toxin, Doctor? Blake asked, his voice low. I've sent a sample to our lab for a full analysis, Dr. Harper replied. We should have results within the next hour. But even if we identify it, we'll need to find the right antidote. And that might not be easy. Blake stood up, his mind racing with possibilities. I need to speak with the people who were closest to Daniel on the field. Someone had to have gotten close enough to inject him. It could have been disguised as a brush or shove during the game. Dr. Harper nodded. I'll let you know as soon as we have more information from the lab. For now, I suggest you look into anyone who might have had a motive. It takes a lot of planning to pull off something like this in the middle of a live match. Thank you, Doctor, Blake said, already moving towards the door. And please, keep me informed of any updates on Daniel's condition. As Blake exited the doctor's office, he pulled out his phone and dialed Ethan's number. The line rang twice before the team captain picked up, his voice tense with worry. Ethan, it's Blake. I need you to meet me in the waiting area, Blake said. I've just spoken to Dr. Harper, and things are more complicated than we thought. What do you mean, detective? Ethan's voice was filled with dread. There's evidence that someone may have deliberately injected Daniel with a neurotoxin, Blake replied. We need to figure out who could have gotten close enough to him during the match. I can't believe this, Ethan stammered, his voice shaky. Who would want to hurt Daniel? He's one of the nicest guys on the team. That's exactly what we need to find out, Blake said firmly. Meet me in 5 minutes. I need to ask you some questions about what you saw on the field. Blake's mind was racing as he headed toward the waiting area. If what Dr. Harper suspected was true, this wasn't just a case of a tragic accident, it was attempted murder. And whoever was behind it was likely still out there, perhaps even watching to see if Daniel would survive. He found Ethan pacing nervously near the vending machines, his face pale and drawn. Detective, Ethan said, rushing over. What did the doctor say? Is Daniel going to be okay? They're doing everything they can, Ethan, Blake replied. But I need your help. The doctor found a needle mark on Daniel's head. We believe he was injected with a neurotoxin during the match. Ethan's eyes widened in shock. What? How is that even possible? We were all so focused on the game. That's what we need to figure out, Blake said. Did you notice anyone getting close to Daniel right before he collapsed? Even something that seemed innocent at the time, a shove, a pat on the back, anything? Ethan frowned, his brow furrowed as he tried to recall the chaotic moments of the match. I remember there was a lot of jostling near the goalpost. The Mavericks defenders were all over us, trying to block Daniel's shot. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Think harder, Ethan, Blake urged. Someone had to have been close enough to inject him. This wasn't a random act, it was calculated. Ethan closed his eyes, straining to remember every detail. Wait, now that I think about it, there was one moment when Leo, one of the Mavericks' defenders, collided with Daniel. It seemed like a normal tackle at the time, but maybe it wasn't. Blake's eyes sharpened. Leo, you say? Was he acting suspiciously? Ethan hesitated. I'm not sure. But after Daniel went down, Leo was one of the first to leave the field. I didn't think much of it then. That's a start, Blake said, his mind already working through the possibilities. We'll need to talk to Leo and review the stadium security footage. If he's involved, we'll find out. With renewed determination, Blake made a call to his contacts at the stadium, instructing them to pull up every camera angle from the match. He knew time was of the essence. If they could confirm Leo's involvement, they might be able to find out who orchestrated this attack, and, more importantly, why they targeted Daniel. The investigation was heating up, and the truth was beginning to reveal itself. But Blake knew that they were still racing against the clock. Daniel's life was hanging by a thread, and if they didn't act quickly, it might be too late. The moon had risen high over the city, casting an eerie glow over the now deserted Maplewood Stadium. The echoes of cheering crowds and the thudding of soccer cleats on the grass had long faded, replaced by a heavy silence that settled over the stadium like a blanket. As Detective Blake drove up to the entrance, he couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. The clock was ticking, and Daniel's life was hanging by a thread. He had to get to the bottom of this mystery, and fast. Detective Blake's car came to a halt with a screech. He stepped out, adjusting his trench coat against the chilly night air. In the distance, he could see two familiar figures standing near the entrance, Emma and Olivia, the young women who had first alerted him to Daniel's collapse. They waved him over as he approached. "Detective Blake, thank you for coming," Emma said, her voice laced with urgency. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she glanced nervously at the darkened stadium. "Of course," Blake replied, his eyes scanning the area. "I hear you might have some leads for me." Olivia nodded, her face tense. "We think the answer might be in the CCTV footage. There was something off about the match, something we couldn't quite put our finger on." Blake's brows furrowed as he listened. "CCTV, huh? Let's hope it holds some clues," he muttered. "But I've been told there's only one camera covering this entire stadium. That's going to make it a bit tricky." Emma bit her lip, clearly frustrated. "Yes, it's an older stadium, and they haven't upgraded the surveillance system. There's just one camera positioned near the main entrance. It barely covers the field, let alone the entire perimeter." Blake sighed, rubbing his temples. "Great. Just one camera for a stadium this size? That's not exactly ideal." As they made their way inside the stadium, the dim emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows along the corridors. Blake felt the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. Daniel was lying in the hospital, fighting for his life, and he was running out of leads. "Where's the security room?" Blake asked, quickening his pace. "Follow us," Olivia said, leading him down a narrow hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily, adding to the tension in the air. Finally, they arrived at a small, cramped room filled with monitors and a tangle of wires. A lone security guard, Mr. Thompson, was sitting behind the console, his eyes bloodshot from watching the screens for hours. "Detective Blake," Thompson greeted, his voice weary. "I heard you might need to see the footage from earlier." "That's right," Blake said, stepping closer to the console. "We're trying to find out who might have gotten close to Daniel during the match. Can you pull up the footage from tonight's game?" Thompson nodded, typing away at the keyboard. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy view of the stadium. The footage wasn't ideal, the angle was too high, and the resolution was poor, making it hard to distinguish faces clearly. Blake watched intently as the footage began to play, fast-forwarding through the first half of the game. The camera was fixed, covering only a portion of the field. The crowd was a blur of indistinct shapes, and the players looked like tiny dots running around. "This footage is practically useless," Blake muttered under his breath, frustration seeping into his voice. Emma, standing next to him, leaned in closer. "Wait, look at this part. Can you slow it down?" Thompson hit a few keys, slowing the footage just as Daniel went in for a critical header that had led to his collapse. Blake's eyes narrowed, focusing on the moment when Daniel made contact with the ball. It was clear that something had happened, but the angle didn't show anyone directly around him. "Rewind that," Blake instructed, his tone sharp. Thompson complied, and they watched the moment play out again. This time, Olivia pointed to a figure at the edge of the frame. "Who's that?" Olivia asked, squinting at the screen. Blake leaned in, his eyes narrowing. The figure was partially obscured by the shadow of the stadium structure, but they could see him moving closer to the field just moments before Daniel's collapse. "Can you zoom in on that person?" Blake asked, though he already knew it was a long shot. The camera's resolution wasn't designed for close-ups. Thompson shook his head. "I'll try, but it's going to be blurry." The image on the screen zoomed in, but as expected, it was a pixelated mess. The figure was a smudge of colors, their features indiscernible. But what stood out was a quick, subtle motion. The person seemed to be reaching for something in their pocket. "That's definitely suspicious," Emma said. "It looks like they were trying to hide something." Blake nodded. "It's not much, but it's a start. Can we get a timestamp for when this was recorded?" Thompson pointed to the bottom corner of the screen. It was right at the 72nd minute, just before Daniel collapsed. Blake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "This means whoever that was, they might have injected Daniel just before he collapsed. But we still need a clearer shot of their face." Blake turned to Emma and Olivia. "Did either of you notice anyone acting strangely near the sidelines during the match?" Olivia shook her head. "No, but we were sitting pretty far up in the stands. We couldn't see much detail from where we were." "Maybe it's worth talking to some of the players who were on the field," Emma suggested. "They might have seen something we missed." Blake nodded. "Good idea. But before that, let's check if there's any footage from outside the stadium. If that person slipped away, they might have been caught on another camera." Thompson's fingers flew over the keyboard again, switching to the exterior cameras. There were only a few, and most were positioned at the parking lot and main gates. The footage from those angles wasn't any better than what they had inside. But then, just as they were about to give up hope, something caught Blake's eye. On one of the exterior cameras, the same shadowy figure could be seen exiting the stadium hurriedly through a side gate just minutes after Daniel was taken to the hospital. This time, the figure's face was slightly more visible, though still obscured by a baseball cap. "There. Pause it!" Blake exclaimed. The screen froze, showing a blurry but slightly clearer image. Blake squinted, trying to make out any distinguishing features. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," he muttered. "Can you print a still of this image?" Thompson nodded, quickly hitting the print button. A small printer beside the console whirred to life, producing a grainy photo of the suspect. Blake took the printout, studying it closely. "We need to show this to Ethan and the rest of the team. Maybe someone recognizes him." Emma and Olivia exchanged hopeful glances. "Do you think this will help, Detective?" Emma asked. "I certainly hope so," Blake replied. "This might be our first real lead. But we're not out of the woods yet. Whoever this person is, they're smart and they've covered their tracks well." Blake's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Dr. Harper. The lab results on the neurotoxin had come in. Blake's heart skipped a beat as he read the text. The toxin was identified as thaloxin B, a rare compound used in biological research, and it was lethal if not treated in time. "Looks like we've got another piece of the puzzle," Blake said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "But we're still missing the most important one, the identity of our attacker." As Blake, Emma, and Olivia exited the security room, they knew the investigation was far from over. The shadowy figure had made one critical mistake by getting caught on camera, and now it was only a matter of time before Detective Blake would catch up to them. Detective Blake stood in the dimly lit hallway of the Maplewood Stadium, staring at the grainy photo in his hand. The figure they had seen leaving the stadium on the CCTV footage was still a mystery, but he was getting closer. Now, it was time to confront the players who had been seen suspiciously moving in and out of the field during the match. Blake knew that in situations like this, the smallest inconsistencies could unravel the truth. With the image still fresh in his mind, Blake walked briskly towards the locker rooms where the team was still gathered. He had been informed by Coach Carter that most of the players were too shaken to leave after hearing about Daniel's critical condition in the hospital. As he entered the room, the air was thick with tension, the players sitting on the benches, heads bowed, whispering among themselves. Blake cleared his throat, and all eyes turned towards him. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need to speak to a few of you in private. This won't take long, but it's important for the investigation into what happened to your teammate." The players exchanged anxious glances, their exhaustion and worry evident. Coach Carter stepped forward, his face pale. "Detective, I'll assist you in any way you need. Who do you want to speak with?" Blake scanned the room, his sharp eyes catching the flickers of nervousness on a few faces. "I need to talk to Adam, David, and Liam." At the mention of their names, the three players looked up in surprise. Adam, a tall and athletic midfielder, immediately stiffened. David, the team striker, frowned but kept his gaze steady. Liam, a younger player who had only recently joined the team, shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Blake motioned towards a quieter area near the entrance. "We'll take this one at a time," he said. "Adam, you first." Adam followed Detective Blake out of the locker room and into a small office that had been temporarily set up for questioning. As the door closed behind them, Blake gestured for Adam to take a seat. The tall player slumped into the chair, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Look, Detective, I don't know what this is about," Adam began defensively before Blake could even start. Blake leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "Relax, Adam. This is just a routine questioning. I noticed you left the field several times during the match. Can you explain why?" Adam's face reddened. I was just dehydrated, okay? I had to get more energy drinks. The game was intense, and I was feeling lightheaded." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Energy drinks? You mean to tell me you couldn't get a drink from the staff on the sidelines? You had to go all the way back to the locker room each time?" Adam hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. Yeah. I prefer a specific brand. The ones on the sidelines don't really do it for me." The detective's eyes narrowed as he studied Adam's body language. "Right. And you weren't carrying anything with you when you left or returned to the field?" "No," Adam said quickly, a little too quickly. He shifted in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his legs. Blake nodded slowly, making a mental note of the player's nervousness. "All right, Adam. That'll be all for now. Send David in next." As Adam left, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than just energy drinks. David, the team's star striker, walked in with an air of confidence. He was well known for his on-field charisma, but as soon as he sat down in front of Detective Blake, a slight twitch of nervousness flickered across his otherwise cool demeanor. "David, I appreciate you taking the time," Blake began. "I noticed you also left the field multiple times during the game. What was going on?" David shrugged nonchalantly. "I had some stomach issues, Detective. The stress of a big match can do that to you, you know." Blake studied him carefully. "Stomach issues, huh? And you went to the restroom each time?" "Yeah," David said, leaning back in his chair, his tone casual. "I had to, relieve myself." The detective's expression didn't change, but he was taking in every detail. "Interesting. The stadium staff reported seeing you near the equipment room. That's quite far from the restrooms." David's confident facade faltered for a split second. "Oh, well, maybe I got lost on the way. It's a big stadium, and I wasn't thinking straight." Blake leaned forward, lowering his voice. "David, this isn't a game. If you're hiding something, now's the time to come clean. Daniel's life is at stake. David swallowed hard but kept his gaze steady. I'm telling you the truth. I was just trying to play my best, and I didn't want to let my team down. Blake wasn't convinced but decided to let David sweat it out for a bit. Alright, you can go. Send in Liam next. Liam entered the room hesitantly, his eyes wide with fear. He was younger than the others, barely out of college, and it showed in the way he carried himself. He looked like a deer caught in headlights as he sat down across from Detective Blake. Liam, Blake said gently, trying a different approach. I know this must be stressful for you, especially since you're new to the team. I just need you to be honest with me. Liam nodded rapidly, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Why yes, Detective. I'll tell you whatever you need to know. I noticed you leaving the field a few times as well, Blake said, his voice calm. Why did you keep going back and forth? Liam's eyes filled with panic. I had a call, sir. My girlfriend was supposed to call me. I've been going through a rough patch, and I didn't want to miss her call. I know it was wrong to leave, but... Blake raised a hand to stop him. A call during such an important match? That doesn't seem like a great priority. Liam's face flushed. I know, but... I was distracted. It was really important to me, sir. Blake could see the fear in Liam's eyes, but something didn't add up. So, you kept going outside the stadium to check your phone? Yes, Liam stammered, but I didn't do anything wrong, I swear. Blake studied him carefully, then nodded. Alright, Liam. You can go. But I suggest you stay close. We might need to ask more questions. Once all three players had left, Blake sat alone in the small room, reviewing his notes. Each player had an excuse, Adam with his energy drinks, David with his stomach issues, and Liam with his phone calls. But Blake's instincts told him that at least one of them was lying. The inconsistencies in their stories were too glaring to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the grainy photo from the CCTV footage again. Could one of these players have been involved in whatever caused Daniel to collapse? He thought back to Dr. Harper's discovery of the needle mark on Daniel's head. If someone had injected him with a dangerous toxin, it had to have happened during those brief moments when Daniel was out of sight. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Emma and Olivia entered, their faces tense. Detective, Emma said, we've been talking to some of the staff, and they mentioned seeing Adam and David arguing before the match. Something about a grudge. Blake's eyes lit up. A grudge, you say? That's very interesting. He stood up, grabbing his coat. We might have just found the crack we need to break this case wide open. As he left the room, he knew that the next set of questions would need to be even tougher. Someone was hiding the truth, and Detective Blake was determined to find out who. Detective Blake sat in the cold, sterile office, his mind racing. The interrogation with the three suspects, Adam, David, and Liam, had provided some answers, but something about Adam's story didn't sit right with him. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that Adam's excuse for leaving the field multiple times during the match, energy drinks, was flimsy at best. The detective had observed the game from the sidelines, and it was evident that a whole stock of drinks was available right on the field. Why, then, would Adam need to leave the game to get drinks? Blake knew that athletes, especially in a high-stakes game like this, would always be hyper-aware of the importance of staying hydrated, but they wouldn't risk leaving the field for something as trivial as a drink when it was so easily accessible. There was more to Adam's story than he was letting on. With the decision made, Blake called Adam back in for a second round of questioning. He stood by the window as Adam walked into the room, looking more nervous than before. The earlier bravado had vanished. Blake noted the way Adam kept glancing at the door, clearly avoiding eye contact. Adam, Blake began, his tone calm but firm, I've had a chance to go over your story, and I have to say, I'm not buying it. You said you left the field to get energy drinks. But, as I recall, there were plenty of those available right on the sideline. So, tell me again, why did you leave the game so many times? Adam shifted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. I don't know what you're talking about, detective. I told you, I was just thirsty. I needed to get some energy drinks. I wasn't feeling well. Blake interrupted, his voice gaining a hint of edge. Come on, Adam. Don't waste my time. You knew there were plenty of drinks available. The staff had them stocked right next to the field. Why would you go all the way to the locker room for something you could have gotten right there? Adam's throat tightened, and his hands fidgeted nervously. The silence between them stretched on for a moment, before Adam let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair. Okay. You're right, he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't go for the drinks. I went because Mark told me to. Blake's ears perked up at the mention of Mark's name. Mark? Who's Mark? Mark Harris, Adam said, his eyes widening as if realizing he had just revealed something he shouldn't have. He's, one of the senior players, you know, from the other team. Blake leaned in, his expression sharp. The other team? You're telling me you left the field, not for drinks, but because Mark told you to. And why would he do that? Adam hesitated, his hands shaking now. He looked at the detective, clearly trying to decide whether to keep the truth buried or let it out. He said he had a plan. A plan to help us win. He said that if I kept Daniel distracted, it would give us the opening we needed. He wanted me to mess with him, get him off his game, make him frustrated. Blake's brow furrowed as he pieced the puzzle together. So, Mark told you to leave the field and distract Daniel? How? Adam swallowed hard. He gave me a needle, detective, Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark told me to use it. He said it would make Daniel less aware. He said if I could mess with his concentration just a little, we'd have an edge. He said he didn't want to risk hitting Daniel during the game, but the needle would slow him down. So, I went back to the locker room to get it. Blake was taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. A needle? You're telling me that Mark Harris gave you a needle to use on Daniel? Yes, Adam replied, nodding frantically. I didn't know exactly what it would do, but Mark said it would make him dizzy, make him lose focus. I didn't know what was in it, I swear. I thought maybe it was just a sedative, something harmless. Blake felt a wave of disgust wash over him, but he pushed his emotions aside. And what happened after you used it? Did you inject Daniel? Adam nodded reluctantly. I didn't inject him directly, but I was supposed to jab the needle near his head, just enough to make him feel off balance, enough to make him slow down a bit. But I never got the chance. I didn't think it would be this bad. Blake stood up and paced the room, processing the information. This was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just an accident or a mistake during the game, someone had intentionally tried to sabotage Daniel. Adam might have been coerced into this by Mark, but that didn't excuse his actions. If Daniel had collapsed because of that needle, it would have been because of a deliberate attempt to harm him. Blake turned back to Adam, who was now slumped forward, his face pale and drawn. So Mark gave you the needle, and you were supposed to inject it into Daniel to distract him during the game. But something went wrong, didn't it? Adam's eyes were filled with guilt. I didn't mean to hurt him. I thought it would just make him dizzy or disoriented. I didn't know the needle would do this. When I saw him collapse, I couldn't believe it. I didn't think it would go that far. Blake exhaled sharply, trying to rein in his anger. He walked to the door and opened it. I want you to stay here. I'm going to speak with your coach, and we're going to figure out what to do next. Don't move. As Blake stepped into the hallway, his mind raced. He couldn't let Mark off the hook. He had to track him down and get him to confess. Mark was clearly the mastermind behind this entire scheme, but Adam had willingly participated. The question now was how deep this conspiracy ran. Had Mark been the only one involved, or were there others? And what about Daniel? How would they explain the needle mark on his head, and how much damage had it done? Blake walked down the corridor towards Coach Carter, who was pacing anxiously outside the interrogation room. "Coach," Blake said, his voice low and steady, "we need to talk." Coach Carter stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with worry. "Detective, what's going on? What happened to Daniel?" Blake took a deep breath. "Daniel didn't collapse because of a head injury from the game, Coach. Someone injected him with a dangerous substance. Adam, one of your players, was involved." Carter's face paled. "No, that can't be right. Adam wouldn't do something like that." "I'm afraid it's true, Coach," Blake replied, his voice grim. He was following Mark Harris's orders. Mark gave him the needle and told him to use it on Daniel to throw him off during the match. Coach Carter stood motionless for a moment, the shock evident in his expression. This is insane. Mark Harris? Why would he do that? He's one of our biggest rivals." Blake nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I'll find out. You and your team need to stay out of the way for now. This investigation is just beginning." Coach Carter gave a shaky nod, still trying to process the gravity of the situation. "I don't know how to fix this, but if Adam's involved, we need to get him the help he needs, and stop Mark before he hurts anyone else." Blake turned and walked towards the exit. "We will, Coach. We will." The room was tense. Detective Blake stood across from Adam, who was slumped in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He had just made a shocking admission. Mark Harris, a player from the rival Maplewood Mavericks, had given him a needle to use on Daniel. But that wasn't the worst part. Adam now had to face the brutal reality that his actions had not only hurt his teammate but could have ruined everything for the Lakeside Lions. Blake sat down across from him, his eyes fixed on the young player. "Adam, you've already told me part of the story. But I need to understand the full truth. Why did Mark want you to inject Daniel? What was his reasoning? This doesn't make sense." Adam gulped and ran a shaky hand through his hair. He was clearly struggling with guilt, but there was no turning back now. He had confessed, and now he had to explain himself. I didn't think it would be like this, Detective," Adam whispered, his voice faltering. "I thought it would just be a way to throw Daniel off, make him dizzy or something. But I didn't know. I didn't know it was going to be this bad." Blake leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me everything, Adam. What exactly did Mark say to you?" Adam's breath caught in his throat. "Mark, he came to me before the game. He said he had a plan to weaken the Lions. He knew Daniel was our best player, the one who could make the difference in the game. So, he gave me the needle. He said it was a special injection that would make Daniel lose focus. Just enough to cause confusion, you know. He didn't want to take him out of the game completely, just slow him down. Just enough to give the Mavericks an advantage." Blake's jaw tightened as he processed the information. "A special injection? And you actually used it on him?" Adam winced, his face red with shame. "I didn't want to, Detective. But Mark, he kept pushing. He said if I didn't help, the Mavericks would lose, and it would be my fault. He even promised me that I wouldn't get into trouble. He said no one would notice. He said I just had to use it quickly, right before Daniel made a big play. He was so convincing." Blake could hear the desperation in Adam's voice. He had been manipulated, pushed into doing something he now regretted. But that didn't excuse what had happened. Someone had deliberately tried to take Daniel out of the game. "So, what happened when you injected him?" Blake pressed, his voice low and firm. Adam closed his eyes, his lips trembling as he recalled the moment. I didn't even want to do it. But I went up to him when he wasn't looking, right before he was going to block the shot. I just pricked him on the side of his neck. I didn't inject the whole needle, just a little. I thought that would be enough to make him lose his focus, like Mark said. Blake's mind raced. And did it work? Did Daniel seem off after that? Adam nodded slowly. At first, he didn't seem to notice. He went on with the game like nothing happened. But then, I saw him wobble. He got dizzy and collapsed right after blocking that shot. I thought it was just a coincidence. I didn't think it would have that much of an effect. But then, he just stayed down. And everyone started freaking out. I didn't know what to do. I just froze. Blake felt the weight of the situation. Mark Harris had orchestrated this entire scheme, using Adam as a pawn to weaken the Lions and ensure the Mavericks' victory. The plan was sinister, calculated, and had nearly led to something far worse than a simple loss. Daniel could have been seriously injured, or worse, if the poison in the needle had been more potent. Adam, Blake said, his voice steady but full of authority, Mark gave you that needle for one reason and one reason only, to poison Daniel and disable him temporarily. His whole plan was to weaken the Lakeside Lions and make sure the Mavericks won without facing any real competition. And you were the one who carried it out. Adam's eyes welled up with tears, and he hung his head in shame. I never meant for any of this to happen, Detective. I didn't know what was in the needle. I thought it was just a sedative or something harmless. But when Daniel collapsed, I knew I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Blake took a deep breath. You need to understand that your actions have consequences, Adam. What Mark did, and what you helped him with, could have cost Daniel his career, or worse. This isn't just about a game. This is about what lengths people will go to for power, for winning. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Adam looked up at him, his voice barely audible. What happens now? Am I going to jail? Blake paused for a moment, studying the young player. We'll have to investigate further. Mark Harris is the real mastermind here. I'm going to make sure he faces the consequences for his actions. But as for you, you've admitted your part, and that shows you're willing to take responsibility. I'll make sure the authorities know that. The detective stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. You stay put, Adam. I need to talk to your coach, and then we'll take it from there. As Blake left the room, his mind was already working. He had Adam's confession, and it was clear now that Mark Harris had planned everything meticulously, using Adam as a pawn to carry out his dirty work. But Blake wasn't done yet. He needed to find Mark and bring him to justice. He walked down the hallway to Coach Carter, who was waiting outside the interrogation room. Coach, Blake said, his voice calm but stern, Adam has confessed. Mark Harris is the one behind everything. Coach Carter's face fell. Mark Harris? From the Mavericks? But why? Why would he do something like this? Blake's expression hardened. Because he wanted to win. Mark knew that Daniel was the best player on the field, and he couldn't afford to lose to the Lions. So, he used Adam to sabotage him. He gave him a needle, a poison that would disable Daniel temporarily. It was a calculated move, and it almost worked. Carter's fists clenched in frustration. I can't believe this. This is beyond anything I imagined. We were just trying to play a fair game. And now someone tried to kill Daniel. Blake placed a reassuring hand on Carter's shoulder. I know it's hard to accept, Coach. But now we know the truth. We're going to find Mark, and we're going to make sure he pays for what he's done. Coach Carter nodded, his jaw tight with anger. I just want to know why. Why go this far? Why hurt someone like Daniel? Blake took a deep breath, the weight of the investigation hanging heavy on his shoulders. I don't have all the answers yet, but I will. We'll find Mark and get to the bottom of this. And when we do, justice will be served. As the two of them walked toward the exit, Blake's thoughts were focused on one thing: Mark Harris would not get away with this. The truth was out, and now the real investigation began. Detective Blake stood in the middle of the stadium, his mind racing. The confession from Adam had provided the breakthrough he needed, but there was still one missing piece: Mark Harris, the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Adam had implicated him, explaining how Mark had orchestrated the plan to sabotage Daniel and weaken the Lakeside Lions. Now, it was time to bring him to justice. Blake's eyes scanned the crowd. The stadium, now empty of fans, seemed quiet, almost haunting after the chaos that had unfolded. Blake's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of his phone. He quickly pulled it from his pocket, his heart skipping a beat as he saw Emma's name on the screen. He answered the call, his voice tense. "Blake here," he said, his tone serious. "Detective, it's Emma," came the voice on the other end. "I've got some important news. I think Mark is already gone." Blake's pulse quickened. "What do you mean gone? Where is he?" "I overheard some of the players talking," Emma continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Mark was last seen heading toward the train station. He was in a hurry, and no one saw him after that." Blake's stomach dropped. He had known Mark was dangerous, but to flee right after orchestrating something as heinous as poisoning his teammate? It only confirmed what Blake had suspected from the start: Mark was willing to do whatever it took to win, even if it meant fleeing from justice. "Thanks for the tip, Emma," Blake replied, his mind already shifting into overdrive. "I'll head there now. Stay on the line in case anything changes. We can't let him get away." He immediately hung up and turned to the team. Coach Carter and Ethan were standing nearby, anxiously waiting for any news on Mark's whereabouts. "Detective, what's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with concern. He had been silent during most of the questioning, his mind still on Daniel, but now that Mark's name was on the table, his frustration was palpable. "Mark's on the run," Blake said firmly. "He's already fled the stadium. Emma overheard that he's heading to the train station. I need to catch him before he gets out of town." Coach Carter's face tightened with anger. "That coward. After everything he did, he's just running away like a thief in the night." Blake nodded grimly. "We need to act fast. If he gets on a train, we may lose him for good. I'll take a car and head to the station. Ethan, Coach, stay here. If anything changes, I'll be in touch." With that, Blake moved quickly toward his car, his footsteps echoing in the empty stadium as he made his way to the parking lot. He couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. Mark had just committed one of the most despicable acts Blake had ever encountered, and now, he was running. He wasn't going to let him get away with it. Blake slammed the car door shut and started the engine, his mind still working through every possible scenario. He had to find Mark. The more he thought about it, the more infuriating it became. This wasn't just about a game anymore. This was about a person's life. Daniel's future could have been destroyed, his career, his health, if not for the quick actions of his teammates and the medical staff. Blake turned onto the main road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he sped toward the train station. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, knowing that every second mattered. If Mark had a head start, he could be halfway to his destination by now, and Blake couldn't afford to lose him. As he neared the train station, Blake's phone buzzed again. He picked it up, his eyes briefly glancing at the screen to see Emma's name once more. "Blake," Emma's voice came through, urgent and breathless, "I just saw Mark. He's definitely on his way to the station. He's moving fast." "Good. Stay with me, Emma," Blake said. "I'm 5 minutes away. Don't lose him." "I won't," Emma replied quickly. But he's really pushing it, detective. He knows you're on to him. Blake cursed under his breath. Mark was smart, that was clear. He had probably planned his escape in advance, but what he didn't know was that Blake was equally determined. The car came to a screeching halt as Blake pulled into the parking lot of the train station. He looked around, scanning the area for any signs of Mark. The station was busy with travelers, commuters rushing to catch their trains, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. Blake stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the crowd. He spotted Emma standing by a bench, her gaze focused on the station's entrance. She waved him over, and Blake quickly made his way to her. "Where did you see him?" Blake asked, his voice low, scanning the crowd. Emma pointed toward the station's entrance. "He went inside just a few minutes ago. He looked like he was in a hurry, but he didn't seem to be paying attention to anyone around him. It's possible he's trying to catch a train out of here." Blake nodded. "Thanks, Emma. Stay here and keep an eye out. I'll head inside and see if I can find him before he gets on a train." Inside the station, the atmosphere was chaotic. People rushed past Blake, some hurrying to board their trains, while others were waiting in lines to buy tickets. Blake's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of Mark. He knew the chances of finding him in the crowd were slim, but he wasn't about to give up now. As he moved deeper into the station, Blake spotted a security guard near the ticket counters. He approached him quickly. "Excuse me," Blake said, showing his badge. "I'm looking for a man, around 6 feet tall, dark hair, wearing a red jacket. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" The guard looked up at him, scanning the crowd. "There's a guy who fit that description who just went toward the platform. He looked a little out of place, like he was in a hurry." Blake's heart raced. This was it. He had to act fast. "Which platform?" he asked. The guard pointed toward the far end of the station. "Platform 3. You might still catch him." Blake nodded and pushed his way through the crowd, heading toward Platform 3. He couldn't afford to lose Mark now, not when he was so close. As he reached the platform, he could see a figure in the distance, moving swiftly toward a train. His heart skipped a beat. It was Mark. Blake quickened his pace, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but he didn't want to escalate things. He needed Mark to stop, to face the consequences of his actions. Mark, however, seemed oblivious to the impending danger as he climbed aboard the train, a ticket in his hand. "Mark!" Blake shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the station. Mark turned around, a look of pure panic on his face. He quickly ducked into the train car and the doors began to close. Blake rushed forward, but it was too late. The train doors snapped shut with a sharp hiss, and the train began to pull away from the station, carrying Mark away from the law. Blake stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. He had been so close. But now, Mark Harris was on the run, and it was going to take everything Blake had to track him down. "Detective?" Emma's voice came from behind him, sounding worried. Blake turned to face her, his expression hard. "He's gone. He's on the train, and I missed him." Emma's face fell. "What now?" Blake clenched his jaw, frustration boiling inside him. "Now, we don't give up. We keep looking, keep searching. He won't get far. I'll find him, Emma. I swear I will." Blake took one last look at the train as it disappeared into the distance. Mark Harris had fled, but Detective Blake would never stop hunting for him. The game was far from over. The train had long since disappeared into the distance, its rhythmic clattering fading away into the background. Detective Rex stood still on the platform, his mind racing. His pursuit of Mark had been interrupted, but the case was far from over. He had come too far to lose now. With Mark fleeing the scene, Rex needed to focus on the next critical step. He had his sights set on Kevin, who had proven to be the missing link in the case. But finding him wouldn't be easy, especially with the chaos of the train station. "Rex, you're not going to let him get away, are you?" Emma's voice cut through his thoughts, her concern still evident. She had been there with him every step of the way, and now, as the tension mounted, she could see the determination in his eyes. "No," Rex replied, his voice steady despite the frustration gnawing at him. "I'm not letting Kevin slip through my fingers. We'll find him. I'm sure of it." Emma's eyes were glued to the bustling crowd around them. The station was alive with movement, people coming and going, unaware of the dark drama that had unfolded only moments before. But Rex knew that somewhere in that crowd was Kevin, and he had to act fast. With purpose, Rex approached a nearby security guard who was monitoring the station's CCTV system. The guard, a middle-aged man with a stern face, looked up as Rex approached. "Detective," Rex said, showing his badge. "I need to access the CCTV footage from the platform. It's urgent." The guard eyed Rex carefully, assessing the situation. "You're looking for someone specific, right? We've got a lot of cameras here, but I need to know which one you're talking about." Rex nodded, his mind already working quickly. "We're looking for Kevin Adams. He's a suspect in a serious case. I believe he's just fled into the station, and I need to know where he went." The guard's expression softened as he understood the gravity of the situation. "All right, give me a moment." The guard quickly led Rex to a small control room tucked away from the main station, where monitors displaying live footage of the entire station were lined up on a wall. Rex felt his pulse quicken as he looked at the screens. He could see the crowds bustling about, people walking to and fro. The camera closest to the platform was the key. It showed the train as it had started to depart, passengers moving about in a frenzy. "This is the one," the guard said, pointing to a screen on the far end of the room. "We've got a clear shot of the entrance and the platform. It should have the footage you need." Rex leaned closer to the screen. His eyes scanned the footage, watching the seconds tick by. His fingers drummed nervously on the side of the desk, knowing that time was ticking away, and Mark was getting further and further from his grasp. But then, his gaze locked onto something. There, on the far left of the platform, was a figure moving quickly. It was Kevin. Rex had been right, Kevin had been trying to flee. His heart raced as he watched Kevin merge into the crowd, his hoodie pulled low over his face, attempting to hide his identity. But Rex had already memorized Kevin's distinctive features. It was him. "Got him," Rex muttered under his breath, his hand clenched in triumph. "There's no escaping now." The guard nodded, seemingly impressed with Rex's quick work. "You can follow him on the next feed," the guard said. "I'll record this for you, too." Rex was already on his way out, motioning to Emma to follow him. "I need a team at the west exit," Rex said, pulling out his phone as he walked briskly toward the exit of the station. "We're going after Kevin." As they reached the front of the station, Rex's phone buzzed again. It was an update from one of his team members. "Detective, we've got eyes on Kevin. He's trying to blend in with a group of commuters. We've got a unit nearby." Rex's expression hardened. "Good. Keep him in sight." The team moved quickly, and within minutes, Rex spotted Kevin, walking casually toward the street, trying to look inconspicuous, but the tension in his movements betrayed him. He was nervous. He had to know that the net was closing in. "Kevin!" Rex called, his voice cutting through the crowded street. Kevin froze, his eyes darting around in panic as he realized he had been caught. For a split second, he stood there, looking trapped, before he turned and started running. But it was no use, Rex was already close behind, his long strides closing the distance in no time. "Stop!" Rex shouted again. "You can't outrun the truth." Kevin's legs pumped furiously as he pushed through the crowd, but Rex was faster. He reached out and grabbed Kevin by the arm, spinning him around. Kevin stumbled, looking up at Rex with wild eyes. He tried to jerk his arm free, but Rex held on tight, refusing to let him go. "Let go of me!" Kevin shouted, his voice shaky. "Not a chance," Rex replied, his grip tightening. "You're under arrest for the poisoning of Ryan, and you're going to tell me everything." "Who put you up to it, Kevin?" Kevin's breathing was erratic, his face pale as he realized there was no way out. He looked around, hoping for an escape, but the streets were crowded with pedestrians, and there was nowhere to hide. "Look, I didn't want to do it," Kevin stammered. "But Mark, he promised me money. $5,000. He said it was just a harmless thing, a little sabotage, just to mess with Ryan. I didn't know it was going to go this far." Rex's face remained impassive as he listened. "Who else was involved?" Kevin hesitated, his gaze darting around nervously. "The coach. Coach Harris. He's the one who told Mark to do it. He promised me the money, told me to take out Ryan and make sure the Lakeside Lions lost. He said it would make the Mavericks stronger and give them an edge." Rex's blood ran cold as he processed the confession. "So it was Mark and Coach Harris who paid you to poison Ryan?" Kevin nodded, his voice small. "Yeah, they thought it would be the perfect way to weaken the team, make it easier for the Mavericks to win the championship." Rex felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You've ruined someone's life, Kevin. All for money. You're lucky Ryan is alive, or it would be much worse for you." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "But I didn't know how far they would go." Rex shook his head in disbelief. "It doesn't matter now. You're coming with me." He handcuffed Kevin and led him to the waiting squad car. The whole ordeal had been a shocking revelation. Mark's plan had been far more intricate and dangerous than Rex could have ever imagined. But the puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, and with Kevin's confession, Rex had the final piece of the puzzle. Back at the police station, Rex prepared the paperwork for the arrest, and soon enough, Kevin was transferred to custody. The news of his confession was quickly spread throughout the department, and the investigation turned toward Coach Harris. "Detective, we've got him," Emma said over the phone. "We've got Coach Harris. He's going to be charged." Rex closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. Finally. This is over. But even as he spoke those words, Rex knew the aftermath would be far from simple. The damage had been done, and the Lakeside Lions had been forever changed. But at least now, Ryan could begin to heal, and justice had been served.